The plane cabin was chaos. Passengers screamed as a man in a black hoodie stormed to the front of the aircraft, brandishing a weapon. His voice, cold and filled with rage, echoed through the narrow aisle. "Everyone stay seated," he yelled. "No one moves, or she dies." He had a firm grip on a middle-aged woman, her blonde hair disheveled, and her eyes wide with fear. The woman trembled as the man pressed his weapon to her side. Her voice, shaky and filled with desperation, broke through the commotion. "Please, someone help me!" But the man only tightened his hold on her, a wicked grin spreading across his face. The passengers were frozen, unsure of what to do, until one man, calm and composed, stood up from his seat. He was tall, with dark skin and a quiet strength in his gaze. He raised his hand slowly to show he was unarmed. "I can help you," the man said evenly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The hijacker laughed bitterly. "What are you going to do? Sit down, hero. This has nothing to do with you." But it had everything to do with him. The passengers didn't know yet, and neither did the hijacker. Not even the trembling woman in his grip realized she had made a terrible mistake, because just 2 hours earlier, that same woman had insulted the man now standing to save her life. She had no idea he was the flight marshal, the only one trained to handle a situation like this, and she had no idea how much she owed him, despite the way she had treated him. It started like any other flight. Passengers shuffled down the aisle, lugging their bags and jostling for overhead space. The hum of engines filled the cabin as the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. Marcus Wilson settled into his seat near the middle of the plane. His dark brown leather jacket creaked as he adjusted himself, slipping a book from his bag. He glanced around, noting the faces of the passengers on board. It was habit part of his training as an air marshal. Most people didn't notice him. To them, he was just another passenger, and that was exactly how he liked it. A loud voice broke his concentration. "Excuse me, this is my seat." Marcus looked up to see a blonde woman glaring down at him. She was well-dressed, her pearl necklace glinting in the cabin lights. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said politely, "but this is 14C, my seat." The woman snorted. "Well, there must be a mistake. I booked this seat." Marcus pulled out his ticket to show her. "See? 14C. Her eyes narrowed. "You must have taken it by mistake. People like you don't usually fly in these seats?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "People like me? You know what I mean," she said, her tone icy. Before Marcus could respond, a flight attendant approached to defuse the situation. After checking their tickets, the attendant confirmed that the woman's seat was actually a row behind Marcus. The woman huffed. "Ridiculous," she muttered under her breath as she moved to her seat. "You'd think they'd keep things organized." Marcus didn't let it bother him. He'd seen worse during his years on the job. But her words lingered in his mind. The flight took off smoothly. Marcus kept a watchful eye, as always, though nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The blonde woman whose name he overheard was Karen continued to mutter complaints throughout the flight. "Too much noise, too cramped. And that man," she said, nodding toward Marcus, "he doesn't belong up here. I don't know why the airlines let just anyone fly these days." Marcus ignored her. He had more important things to focus on. A few rows ahead, a man in a black hoodie was fidgeting. He kept glancing around nervously, checking the time on his watch. Marcus had noticed him boarding earlier, carrying a duffel bag that seemed heavier than it should have been. Something about him felt off. Marcus subtly alerted the flight attendants, asking them to keep an eye on the man while he observed from his seat. The man stood up suddenly, heading toward the restroom with his bag. Marcus shifted in his seat, ready to follow if necessary. And then it happened. The man emerged from the restroom, his hoodie pulled low over his face. He reached into his bag and pulled out a weapon, shouting for everyone to stay seated. The passengers screamed. Marcus' training kicked in immediately. He pressed the button to alert the cockpit and stood up, ready to act. The man with the hoodie stormed toward the front of the plane, his weapon held high. His voice was sharp and commanding. "Nobody moves! Sit down! Stay quiet and do what I say!" Gasps and cries rippled through the cabin. The flight attendants froze, their faces pale with fear. Marcus took in every detail, the man's posture, his tone, the way he kept checking his surroundings. This wasn't a random act. This guy had a plan, and it was up to Marcus to figure it out before anyone got hurt. But before Marcus could make his move, the hijacker grabbed the nearest passenger. "Karen, get up!" the man barked, yanking her out of her seat. Karen let out a shriek, stumbling as he pulled her toward the aisle. Her fear was palpable as she begged, "Please, I don't know what you want. Don't hurt me." Marcus' jaw tightened. This wasn't just about Karen, she was a pawn in the hijacker's scheme. "You're my insurance," the hijacker sneered, keeping his weapon trained on her. "Anyone tries to be a hero, and she's the first to go." Marcus took a deep breath. He needed to act, but he couldn't risk anyone else getting hurt. 10 minutes earlier, Marcus had already sensed trouble. The man in the hoodie had been acting suspicious since the plane took off. He kept adjusting his bag, muttering under his breath, and glancing at the cockpit door. Marcus had seen that kind of behavior before. It was the look of someone building up the nerve to do something reckless. He had quietly alerted the flight attendants to watch the man while he formulated a plan. But before Marcus could act, the situation escalated. Now, Karen was in danger, and the man had taken control of the cabin. Marcus stayed calm, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "Let her go," he said firmly. The hijacker sneered. "You think I'm stupid? I'm not letting her go until I get what I want." "And what is it you want?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady. The hijacker grinned darkly. "I want the world to listen. People like me are being silenced. It's time they know who's in charge." Marcus' heart sank. He knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with, a white supremacist, fueled by hatred and looking to make a statement. The hijacker waved his weapon at the passengers, barking orders. "You all sit still and shut up. No calls, no texts, nothing. If I see one phone, this lady gets it." Karen sobbed, her hands trembling as the man dragged her toward the cockpit. Marcus stood slowly, his eyes locked on the hijacker. "I'm the only one who can help you," he said. The hijacker laughed. "Help me? You're just another passenger. Sit down before I make you sit." But Marcus didn't budge. Karen, through her tears, recognized him. Her face twisted with disbelief. "You? What are you doing?" Marcus glanced at her briefly, but didn't answer. He took a step closer to the hijacker. "You don't want to do this," Marcus said. "You're outnumbered. You've got no way out." The hijacker's grip on Karen tightened. "I said sit down!" The passengers held their breath, watching the standoff. In one swift motion, Marcus reached for his jacket, revealing his badge. "Marcus Wilson, Federal Air Marshal," he said. His voice was calm, but there was steel in his tone. The cabin erupted in gasps. Karen's eyes widened as realization hit her. The man she had insulted, the one she thought didn't belong, was now her only hope. The hijacker faltered for a split second, his eyes flicking to the badge. It was all Marcus needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the hijacker's weapon and twisting it out of his grasp. Karen stumbled backward, falling to the floor as Marcus wrestled the man to the ground. The passengers erupted in cheers as Marcus secured the hijacker, pinning him down until backup arrived. When the plane landed safely, Karen approached Marcus hesitantly. Her face was a mix of shame and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she stammered. Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Just treat people better," he said simply. Karen nodded, tears welling in her eyes. As Marcus walked away, the other passengers applauded him, their cheers echoing through the terminal. For Marcus, it was just another day on the job, but for everyone else on that flight, it was a day they would never forget.